welcome to Oclef Kinder's podcast. I'm Dr. Glenda, and our goal is to make a program for students to prepare them for Oclef piano lessons at the age of 7. Today, I'm interviewing the one and only Dr. Eric Rasmussen, PhD in music education. He chairs the Peabody Preparatory's Early Education Music Department and is a music specialist at 2 Hopkins-affiliated early childhood learning centers. Rasmussen has been on the forefront of early childhood music education research and has authored a songbook for early childhood music educators, which includes a special sequence for teaching harmony to very young children. He composes music for children ages birth to 9 years old and presents at regional, national, and international conferences. And he's currently performing research in music aptitude and has specialized in the music learning theory of Edwin Gordon. You can read even more about him on the Peabody website for a full bio. So welcome, Dr. Eric. It's so nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. Can I call you Dr. Eric? My students call me Dr. Glenda.
My kids, Mr. Eric, because they're afraid of getting shots.
Yeah, doctor does sound a little scarier.
Dr. Eric is great.
Dr. Eric, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so I've been reading some of your research, and I've also been listening to your podcast online, which is called Audiation in the Wild. For some of us out there, not everyone knows what audiation is. It was a relatively new topic to me just a year ago. So could you quickly define what audiation is for our audience?
Yeah, audiation is analogous to what thinking is to language. Audiation is to music. Before you start speaking, you create a thought. Where does that thought come from? That's a subject of debate, what instigates those things.
Yeah.
But basically, if you can think something, then you'll be able to say it. As you say things, you're also able to grow your vocabulary and think using that vocabulary. So kids get a repertoire of all these words. And of course, the earlier you start reading to them and all that, the more they're able to put their own thoughts together, as long as they've got good vocabulary around them and good skills of other people interacting with them. So how does that develop in music? Same way, except that instead of words, you're looking at the components of music, especially tones, rhythms, and harmony. Tones being like a note. People call that a note, but a note is written, and a tone is heard. And then rhythms, ba-ba-ba, and then harmonies that go. And so you want to be able to think those things while you're playing them or before you play them. Otherwise, we're reacting. And that's great, too, because there's all kinds of new music that I listen to that I don't know where it might go. So you want to be able to predict what's happening. Otherwise, you're not going to follow along with what people are saying. You hear, if somebody spoke Mandarin to you, you hear it perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with your ears.
Yes.
But what happens afterwards? Can you translate only if you're a Mandarin speaker or someone who understands or thinks in Mandarin? Are you going to be able to follow along?
Right. That makes total sense. That reminds me of a lesson I had in my undergrad. I was an oboe major, and I was like sight reading an etude or something, and my teacher kept saying, that is not the sound that we're going for. It almost seems like you're playing something, reacting to the sound that you created, and then trying to correct it. And I was like, that is what I'm doing. And she was like, no, you have to imagine the sound first and then strive to create that sound that you imagined.
Yes, imagine, though, is rooted in image, right? So that you can imagine a purple dog, but you can't imagine a symphony. You need to audiate it.
Yes.
Because that's a great parallel as well.
Yeah, so it was like a missing piece of my vocabulary at that point in my life of being able to audiate something before playing it. And I think this goes back to the way that we learn music, something that I've thought about for a long time. And I know you have too, just from reading what you've been writing. Like when I was learning in band class, they put a book in front of you and they give you an instrument and they're like, that note is this finger, note is this fingering. So of course that kind of brings me to my next question. I was basically just decoding. And This is another word that I've heard you talk about in your podcast. And it's still I wonder if you could talk to me about the difference between decoding and I think you were saying here's a little quote from the Gordon MLT website. It says, students taught according to MLT, music learning theory, learn to read notation, but only after they have developed the ability to audiate the note patterns written on the page. Reading becomes a process of recognition rather than decoding. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this difference between recognition and decoding.
Yeah, yeah. When we teach the alphabet
Hmm.
and you put those letters together, those are words that we speak. And when you're called on in fourth grade, like I was, and you read 2 to 3 sentences, and then they ask you, what was that about? And I said, I don't know. I sounded out all the
Yeah.
words, and I wasn't thinking along while I was speaking,
Hmm.
right? I was deciphering the letters in front of me and sounding out the words, but I was close, but I wasn't quite reading with understanding.
Yeah.
When we teach audiation prior to reading, now you've got a thinking vocabulary or an audiation vocabulary before you're trying to extract meaning from the page. You're actually giving meaning to the page,
Yes.
right? Just because you know the alphabet doesn't mean that you're going to understand German at all, even though it's exactly the same
Yes.
26 letters and then the umlauts or whatever. You can add some other special characters to it. But all of the languages that use that script doesn't give you access to any meaning whatsoever. So the alphabet is theoretical. It's nice to know and good to know when it's appropriate to start putting your letters together to make you write your name. That's one of the
Hmm.
first things children can really relate to. And the joy that comes when, say, my daughter had bathtub crayons, and when she made her own name when she was 3, she just was just like, wow, I understand. It's like this level
Yeah.
of understanding that you have control to put your thoughts down now.
Yes.
And that's what reading is good for. We couldn't play Beethoven symphonies if we only learned by rote. You could, and that would be tremendous. It would just be arduous and a lot easier if you were to be reminded what notation does. It reminds us of what it is that we can already audiate. Yeah, it's fundamental to all music learning, whether people think it is or not. It's just there are people who think and people who don't think when you talk to
Yes.
them sometimes, and you can tell the difference, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
yeah,
yeah.
so a musician that can think and invent on the spot, like an improviser or somebody who can create and compose music, those are higher level skills of audiation than it is to just read what somebody else has done. Now, not that reading is bad at all, but if we can do that at a really high level, and you've got enough vocabulary and enough experiences with all these kinds of sounds and ideas, now you've got maybe the bug and itch to create your own or
Hmm.
to play, like
Yeah.
in the sandbox, play with others
Yeah.
rather than the 1, 2, ready, go. That you could actually form a group where I just joined a band just last Friday,
Nice.
and they sent me 20 tunes, and it's like I had 3 days to look at these 20 tunes. I didn't read them at all. I listened to them by ear, and I started to put them together. Now I'm not that good,
Hmm.
but I was good enough that I understood what I needed to show them by the time rehearsal came around. And
Yes.
now we're adding another 5 songs this week. I'm on the hot seat. To be able to audiate something that's unfamiliar to me, if it is, but most of it is not totally familiar. But it's a fun exercise. It's like learning to cook something new when you don't have the recipe.
Yeah. That's a good way to look at it. I definitely had that experience when I sang with a choir, the Jazz Mafia Choral Syndicate, shout out. They most of the people in that choir come from a not a classical background, like an R&B or rock or pop or just like a choral background and may read music to some extent, but not to the extent that I do, coming from a very classical background and they rely on their ears more. And so I was sent like, yeah, a bunch of tracks to learn by ear and like really specific alto parts with all these little like
Hmm.
R&B ornaments that had to be done exactly the same way every time.
Oh, yeah.
And doing this without music notation was so frustrating for me, but it's just because of my experience. I'm really skilled at reading and writing music, but I'm not as skilled at learning by ear. And
Yeah, I'm going to
so,
guess you didn't grow up in a gospel church.
no, I
I had a tremendous presentation that I attended at the Gordon Institute for Music Learning this last summer, and the none of the choirs that sing gospel, the traditional gospel choirs that are all over the country,
yeah.
use notation at all. Nobody.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
They have a
amazing.
bass player, they have a drummer, and they may have a keyboard player, and that's it. And everything else is learned the Wednesday before you perform it.
Yeah,
And you
and then you
just,
have to remember it by Sunday
and
still on Sunday.
yeah, it's an astonishing amount of
Yeah,
musicianship.
it
You
is.
say that they don't read music, and we want people to read music. Some of the greatest musicians ever to have lived didn't read.
Yeah,
Art Tatum, blind, 80%
yeah.
in one eye and 100% in the other. Errol Garner didn't know a lick of music theory.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, didn't know much at all when he wanted, and yet he was a great arranger. But
Yes.
he would just play on the piano what he wanted the trumpet section to play. Okay, three trumpets, here's your part. And they would learn it by ear. Trombones, here's your part. And he would orchestrate in real time kind of that.
And the
And
band would just remember, or was there like a
well,
scribe furiously
well,
writing it all down?
depends on how they were audiating. But can you imagine? And all the pianists of the era and other musicians as well said that he was by far the best pianist they'd ever noticed or had ever seen.
Yeah,
And you just notice how his left hand is completely solid, boom, stride piano or whatever style. He could do just about anything. And his right hand would play with the beat up and back a little bit, and one swing differently and all that. But while it's like watching two different humans at the same
it's
time.
amazing.
And yet he looks like he's hardly paying attention.
He could
Yeah,
like have a conversation with you while doing that, probably.
YouTube videos of Earl Garner are just really fascinating to watch.
I will. I will. But harsh transition, but I know we're running low on time. I watched a few YouTube videos of you with your students leading them through, they looked like maybe first or second graders, and you were leading them through a chord progression and having them like raise their hand like, "Oh, that's the."
Showing the fingers of the sounds that they heard. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was really amazing to me, and that it was showing me what's possible, like what kind of music vocabulary we can build into a student before they even play the piano or look at notation. Like there's a lot we can develop their audiation brain
And their
essentially.
harmonic audiation comes
Yes.
before all of it. And this is the thing
Really?
I've discovered in
Okay.
the last 10 years or so. And it's eventually it'll make itself into music education, but probably not because people like to stick to their tribes.
Yeah.
That's how things go, at least in my experience. There are a few tribe members of people that understand music learning theory well who have bought wholeheartedly into this phenomenon I've discovered that as young as 2 years old, they can hear the difference between tonic and dominant, or between the pentultimate sound and the last sound of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Fleeces white
Yeah.
as, and you play that chord, ba da dee da. What does that chord sound like? And then snow, ba da dee da dum. What does that sound like? And if you can tell that at 2 years old and build that out, that makes learning to sing, I think, more context. You've got context.
Yeah.
And once you've got context, and that's what audiation is built inside of, you've got to know and understand your context. Because I would speak differently to you if we were on a different radio show,
Yeah.
or if I were in a different arena. It's possible we would have different uh, points to make depending on the listening public.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I know you've taught a lot of different ages, but you really like teaching early childhood. What has been like we were talking before I started recording, I think you said that after the age of 4, they go over the hill. So I'm wondering,
Yeah,
what is this developmental change that you see at age 4?
it's somewhere between 3.5 and 6,
Mhm.
say. But if you haven't had a rich, robust experience with your language, can you imagine not learning your language until after 3?
Yeah, that would be
So
insane.
musically, what are we doing with children? So, and the brain, listen, it's 1,000 trillion cells in the brain developed by age 3. And then most of learning after that is about pruning those cells and making more straight lines in the neurons and bringing those, they call it myelin sheaths that form around to make those pathways strong
Neural
and
pathway.
stable,
Mhm.
right? That all happens before you get into school, even if you are Head Start,
Yeah.
right? At 3 or 4. If by then you have 20,000 words in your vocabulary instead of 2,000, there's no way you're going to be behind in language or vice versa. If you don't have enough vocabulary, it's going to be very difficult for you to read. So rather than build up that vocabulary, listening and speaking vocabulary with kids, we teach them how to read and write, and they're not ready. And that puts a huge obstacle in the way of kids that didn't have enough listening and speaking vocabulary early in life. And the same thing happens with music. It's very analogous, but not, it's not.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I remember there was a research topic I was studying in grad school that I was my claim, like my thesis was basically that if you cannot learn, if you're really good at reading and writing music, that but you can't improvise, then if you're equating that to language, that means you could essentially read Shakespeare, but you can't like freely improvise a conversation with somebody. That was
Yeah,
like my claim. And you're right, it's not exactly analogous, but it makes the point of like, you can't speak music yet. You're just reading music.
yeah, it is very limiting that way
Yeah.
if you don't have those other powers of audiation. Of course, they come naturally. They don't necessarily have to be taught, and there's an interaction between that early music environment and a method that might incorporate the music learning theory principles.
Mhm.
But mostly, if a child has a moderate or even low to moderate aptitude, if they're taught appropriately, everybody will gain the same skills. It's just that some might be able to really go far, and some would at least be able to play in a garage band on their block and still experience the joy of music, regardless of your ability or talent, or people call these all these things, but it's an aptitude. And I developed an aptitude measure
Yeah.
for 2 to 7 year olds to help me understand how to better teach them. And it just gives me data to understand how children are learning, because I want to understand how they're learning,
Yeah.
and then I know how to teach better. And if you think you're going into a lesson and you know what you need to be teaching, what and you're not basing that in how the child is learning music in front of you and what stages of audiation they're in, or what types of audiation they can use, or how much vocabulary they have
Mhm.
in, say, major and minor or other tonalities,
Yeah.
because the more differences you have, the more you're able to distinguish among things. So
Yeah.
if you only experience black and white, you're not going to have a skill to be an artist.
Yeah.
And so we want to give them as many colors as possible. One of my favorite analogies, here's another one, is
Yeah.
I like to give kids not just a buffet, but a buffet in as many cultures as possible, and let them choose what they really enjoy eating out of that
That's
buffet.
really
What
good.
song do you like with this? You don't have to like my songs. I don't. That's a matter of opinion. But with all these kinds of experiences, children have, they get a little bit of a say so
Mhm.
in what you do. Oh, I really want this song today. Okay, I'm down with that. I'm gonna take that for all it's worth, and I'm gonna drill down inside of the harmonic structure, the form, the the intonation, or whatever, the tonalities, the meters, and get them to move their bodies and be expressive. At the bottom of all this is how much expression can you give. There are some nuts and bolts, but music learning theory doesn't always get tagged with being too expressive about how we teach music. But it's just a different component of there's no, you got to start loud before you start soft. No, soft and loud go with each other, or getting
Exactly.
louder, getting softer go with each other. So high and low, that's the bow's concept, because this is high on a bass. I'm drawing a line from
Yeah.
my face to my waist. That's going higher on a bass. It's when your hand goes down.
Yes. It's
and
all really,
and on a piano, it's left to right is going higher. So that doesn't make
and
sense to young children.
it doesn't
High
at all. Yeah, I've noticed
high
that.
and low is a bogus concept in music. It's only faster vibration and slower vibration. And little children, 2, 3 years old, they understand that for some reason. They're very literal. They are very attached to the physical world, not the language world.
And they're so curious. When I
Yeah.
have students ask, why is a sound higher and why is a sound lower? I will literally draw them the wavelengths and be like, look at how this one is twice as many inside of the same space as this and that. And
Yeah.
you might think this is like a high school science concept, but it's a visual concept that you can grasp and
Yeah.
they get it and they're like, oh. And to me, that makes so much more sense than just being like, it's just science. You'll learn that later.
John Dewey, the father of American education, a brilliant man, said you could teach anything to anyone at any age as long as you present it appropriately and give children, as long as you're in the world of where the children are, not trying to bring the children to where you are,
Yes.
just you go be where the children are, and there you'll play. And then, so it's structured guidance or informal guidance at times, where you're not trying to teach this concept necessarily. And
Yeah.
they'll come to discover the concepts that you're trying to teach on their own if you're dancing in their world, because they're hungry to learn. They
Yeah.
just don't want to learn the way we're teaching.
Yeah. Exactly.
If you're failing, that it's all on you. It's not because the child isn't ready.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's exactly what we've discovered in Oclef. The lessons that we teach are really effective for students 7 and up and not for 6 and below, and so there's it's not that students can't learn, it's that we need to create a different program for this early age group.
Yeah, you could start piano at 9 months, but here's how it would look. Grandma bounces you on her lap while she plays the piano. The
Exactly, yeah.
child hits the piano, and you hit the piano back, and you start a conversation on the piano. See, that's 9 months, right?
Yes.
And that's perfect play opportunities, right? Of
Yeah.
course, it's like when the child's done, you're done. So you don't want to pay half-hour lessons for that, but you do want to pay a half-hour a week or hour a week lessons for that child to be in the community of other babies and other parents and
Yeah.
other musicians that are playing together, because that's different in a class, not just a performance where you go to listen. No, that they're encouraged to participate however they are. And babies and toddlers, I tell the parents all the time, they're perfect. They're
Yes.
going to never do anything wrong. If they're having a complete meltdown, that's not wrong. It's perfect.
Yeah, that's just
It's
their
because they either are overstimulated by music and they're like that, or that they're in a strange environment, or blah 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 blah. And it's up to us to manage their emotions, their musical entry into a special world where they are exposed to many things outside of what might typically happen at home. So
Yeah.
that's why I do my early childhood program and why I love it so much.
I love teaching those programs. So I've done with a few different brands, like Mommy and Me or Baby and Me style classes, and they're
Hmm.
so much fun. And yeah, I try. Sometimes parents are worried that they're not clapping the beat or whatever. They'll do that when they're ready. Right now, they're just absorbing all this information,
Yes,
and then one day
yes,
they're gonna clap on the beat, and we're all gonna celebrate. But like
yeah,
right
yeah.
now, they're just absorbing everything. Like
Yeah, I just want them to be expressive. And if they're
yeah,
clapping early, that's fine. If they're not, that's fine. I don't
yeah,
encourage people to teach clapping, because that's just the stuff that's on the beat. Music happens so much more in between the beat, with the stylistic differences
yeah,
and the just think of just in classical music. Go back to the Gregorian chant all the way up to the present. Just if you take that strict Western look, there's so much variety there. And the more variety, the more differences there are for a child to understand. The more differences, the more they'll be challenged, and the more they challenge themselves, the more they have the opportunity to take full advantage of the innate aptitude with which they're
Mhm.
born.
That's awesome. I know we're going way over time. Thank you for chatting with me. I was like, it'll be so quick. I could talk to
Oh,
you for hours, I think, but let's just end with one more question. What has been, it's a very general question, but what has been one of the most rewarding aspects of your teaching early childhood music for you?
for me, it's just watching the musician grow. I can't get enough of those breakthrough moments where a child all of a sudden starts singing in tune, and they've been quiet for 2 years, and now they pop out and they're just brilliant, and you never knew because you
Yeah,
don't see the result of it. So it's magical. Just to be in presence of children is magical. And then
it
when you're
is.
teaching them, music is such a special kind of art form, like there is nothing else in the world. And so when you get to give that away, and then 10 or 20 years later, you meet the mom on the train to the Orioles game, and they say, "Oh, by the way, that's your guy behind you. You're talking about, and
Oh
he's
my
6'1", and he's the lead in the school play,
God.
and like that." And you just go, "I don't know how much I had to do with that, but boy, oh boy, if we had parallel universes, we could do research on it." But
Maybe we do. We just don't know how much.
I just know that when you're giving that amount of extra care and energy and variety to young children, as much variety as possible, that their musical brain is starting to get baked. And by the time they're 6, 7 years old, now they can use that brain in different ways,
Hmm.
but that musical foundation is baked in at that point. It's not doesn't mean that they can't keep learning forever, but
Of course.
it that's silly to say. But that there's a certain level of aptitude that starts to stabilize at that point, and it's so critical. So I think of myself as I am just the nurturer of the soil around the kid, and they're going to have all those nutrients in that soil for as long as they live. But I'm not necessarily going to see them fruit.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way to look at it. That you're creating a music garden, growing all these children that are flowers going into their lives. Thank you so much, Mr. Eric. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you.
Yep, it's been my pleasure as well. Thank you.
Thank you.